Thank you for joining today's webinar presentation, our Industry Market Analysis Update from English Australia. My name is Brett Blacker. I'm the CEO of English Australia, and I'll be joined by Svetlana Cruz, the Senior Research Manager from Bonard, our key research partner who supports all of the work we undertake for the important project of our annual market survey. Commencing today's webinar presentation, I'd firstly like to acknowledge the Department of Education. The Department of Education are the funding support base for this project and have been for a long time. We wouldn't be able to run this survey without their valuable support and enabling us to do the research and provide these insights on an annual basis, critical data for our market and market intelligence, and be able to offer it free of charge to all of those participating colleges. So a very special thanks to the Department of Education. I'd also like to once again thank and acknowledge Bonard, and Bonard as our research partner for many years on this project, as well as a number of other key research and market analysis projects, do a first-class job in not only gathering the data, and I'm sure many of you that have worked with Bonard will know their exceptional customer service, but also in terms of analysis and interpretation of the data as well. Today, as I mentioned, Svetlana will assist in the presentation and provide some critical insights specifically from this data. Moving into today's session, what we aim to cover in a short period of time over the next hour is to give you an update on the outcomes of the 2021 annual market survey. In addition to that, we will try and drill down into some of those key insights that we've seen happen on a regional level, state-based level, and looking at provider type cuts of the data, which gives us a way of looking at the insights from the data more specifically attuned to the different type of provider. And we know historically this has been really valuable when we're looking at different visa types and different nationalities and their student preferences often to different types of colleges. We're also going to provide a quick update on where things are going year to date in terms of 2022, student visa commencements only, and a few insights on the student visa data as well. So moving into today's presentation, first of all, I would like to just cover the Alicos sector analysis in terms of the big picture perspective. Looking at what's happened, and obviously the past 2 years has been devastating for our English language teaching sector here in Australia. Over the year of 2021, and this is done on a headcount basis, I do need to preface, including students that are in Australia or offshore, and those that may be on a student visa or studying on another visa type. And we will provide a breakdown of those different elements of visa type as part of today's session. The big picture in this piece has been the decline of 56% in student numbers. That was in 2021 compared to 2020, and the decline in student weeks at 59%. If I look at that over the 2-year period from where we were in 2019, this represents a drop or a decline in students of over 130,000 students since 2019. And essentially that represents a 77% market decline over the 2-year period where borders remained closed because of the COVID-19 pandemic. If I break that down just in terms of our student visa cohort alone, what we can see here is that the market dropped from 2020 to 21 by 56%, and from 118,000 students down to around 29,000 students in total. On that student visa data, and when we do move into the final part of today's presentation, the 29,000 essentially represents around a 20-year low in student numbers for Australia. And so effectively, as we've moved into 2022, We've up until the last couple of months in particular, we've been tracking at numbers which were lower than where we were back in 2002, which really signifies the impact of what the border closures had for the Alicos sector. One thing to note, though, is obviously Australia, part of the broader ecosystem of international students and international enrolments. We always benchmark the global position for Australia, that compared to our other, the 8 key global destinations for English language students. And typically we've seen Australia between number 3 and number 2 in our student numbers and student weeks. And that goes between Australia, led by the UK in student numbers and led by the US in student weeks. I just want to note that the data that you're seeing now is based on the 2020 data set. And one of the elements that we need to consider is when each of those other global destinations release their 2021 data, we're anticipating that to be in around the next few weeks or very shortly. We'll be able to recast this data and look at it in terms of what was Australia's position relative to the other major destinations in 2021. But I do want to point out that whilst the situation in Australia was dire, and as we've looked at in terms of the decline in student numbers, in 2020, Australia actually became the #1 destination in terms of the volume of student weeks being taught, which was quite amazing if you think that of all the destinations where students could or have traditionally studied, whilst our position of numbers declined, the average duration actually was quite long, and we'll have a look at that in terms of the number of weeks in a moment. And that meant that Australia became the #1 destination for teaching students in terms of the volume of student weeks in 2020. To move on now, I'm going to just cut a little bit on the student profile and what that makeup of students was. If you look back traditionally across our student profile, we've had the market share and some of the unique insights that this survey and report shows is the breakdown between students that come to study English language in Australia on a student visa and those that come and study on a visitor or working holiday or other visa type. And now remembering before the pandemic impacted and the 2020 border closures, all of the prior years to that were only measuring, for the most part, it was students onshore, face-to-face here in Australia. A very minor part was looking at transnational students, which we've surveyed, but didn't really make up a large volume of the cohort. In the last period, the biggest change you can see over historical years has been, we've previously had periods where typically around a third of all of the students studying in Australia were here on a student visa, and indeed up to, in many of our state perspectives, up to half of the students were here not on a student visa. The most significant decline over the past 2 years has no doubt been in the non-student visa types, visitor and working holiday. But if we break that down in terms of the type of visas, what we have seen was a big drop, obviously, in working holiday, as those visa programs were essentially unable to be mobilised, but a significant increase in this data set on the other visa. So typically other visa may have been used very sparingly if a provider wasn't able to uniquely categorise one of our students by the type of visa that they were here on. The 15% growth that you can see on the chart at the moment, or the descriptor just to the right of the chart, that actually was the growth between 2020 and 21. The actual percentage of other visas represented here, it's around 24% of all of the students that were studying in 2021 were recorded by our providers and the participating institutions. They were recorded as other because they were studying their English language course offshore. And if they didn't have a student visa, they were categorized as other. In terms of the position and Australia's position, I mentioned that we had moved from typically number 2 to number 1 in student volumes. And so I'm just going to show you what that looks like in terms of the average duration of students by student weeks. And here you can see, even though we had the vast majority, and we'll give a breakdown of the student cohort onshore and offshore throughout this presentation, but looking at those students that were still continuing to study either offshore or onshore on a student visa, we saw a real resilience in their ability to, for the most part, study online. And I think it's testament to the way in which colleges have really evolved, innovated and adapted their teaching delivery to be able to not just cater for those students, but to be able to engage students for significant periods of study in an online environment. And I think that's one of the key outcomes from this survey, was to show that not just did we see the large increase in students studying on other or non-student visas, but the period of study was really significant. I'm now just going to quickly look at the results on a regional level and provide a few insights in terms of the big picture global mobility. We'll then break that down a little bit in terms of countries, and Svetlana will give us more detail on a state level. So here, I guess, as you would expect or anticipate, the largest decline we witnessed in terms of percentage or loss of total market occurred out of the Europe-based nationalities. And what we did note is that of those students, we historically had a number of them here that would come on those working holiday or other visa types, and typically, study tours and other elements that may not be captured in that student visa. There was also a lower proportion of the European students that seemed to translate into online study, and that real appeal of the travel study component, the onshore experience, seems to be a large part of the demographic of the European students' choice of study destination. The biggest proportional decrease in terms of loss of numbers was through Asia Pacific, with the market effectively going down by about 28,000 students across that group. In there, it was a little bit sheltered, and we'll give some data through the presentation, by the students, particularly from China, that continued to study online offshore, but also a number of other countries throughout Asia, which again had more appetite for doing their study online whilst the borders were closed. The European market did absolutely dip, 74%, as I mentioned, but we probably want to see what's going to now come or return to Australia, particularly out of the big declines across Asia Pacific. When I mentioned those students that were studying on different visa types, we, as part of this survey, do also measure economic impact, and the economic impact of both the direct study, so whether that student is the amount that they're paying for their fees, but also the multiplier that we see in Australia out of the indirect economic benefit from them through accommodation, hospitality, retail, etc. And what we did know in terms of a big picture is essentially, since the start of the pandemic, the economic contribution has declined at 82% over that 2 years, or just under $2 billion in terms of total injection of funds to Australia because of the border closures. And so we dropped by $1.94 billion over that time. Moving into the data on top 10 source countries, in a mix of countries was relatively stable. And indeed, in fact, the 10 countries that we had between 2020 and 2021 remained consistent. We had a bit of a change in some of the nationality ranking, particularly from Nepal, which rose from 7th spot in 2020 up to the 4th spot in terms of ranking overall in 2021. And India, which moved from 9th position in 2020 up to the 7th position in 2021. Overall, the top 10 source countries still make up around 3/4, I should say, of all of our total number of students. But certainly in terms of the proportional decreases, we'll start to drill down into some of those, and particularly on a state-based and provider level throughout today's webinar. Just quickly, I'll cover off a bit in terms of the visa share. As you would expect, the majority of the students that were studying over this period had to be retained on a student visa, or, as referenced earlier on, were captured as an other visa type. China, essentially, in terms of market, I mentioned, stayed somewhat sheltered in terms of the market decline, huge losses in number of students. But in terms of the total number of students that were studying online, offshore, and online offshore with no visa, 56% of those were from China. Japan was the second largest source region, and that accounted for around 13% of the total student body that were in that same category of online offshore. Very quickly, and the market's already changed quite a lot as we've moved into 2022, but just worth noting that there were significant declines from, as you would expect, China, Colombia, Japan, Brazil, South Korea, those top markets, so traditional top markets. And we saw a little bit of growth, a bit of diversity come through from some markets which may not have necessarily had the capacity in terms of the online onshore experience previously, but we have seen uptake, particularly in the offshore market. And I just note that Kuwait, Zimbabwe, Nigeria, for example, some of the market diversification that's come out of the way in which we've been able to innovate in terms of using online education and breaking down some of the traditional borders and barriers too. I'm only going to very quickly look at the data by provider type. Conscious we've still got quite a bit to get through on a state level and given a national perspective to everyone online. What we did note in terms of the provider type, and I just want to again reference in terms of the methodology we use here. If the provider only teaches Alicos and they don't have other courses on scope, then they're Alicos only. If they're attached to a school, they'll be ranked in school category. If they're vet-based, which means they have both Alicos intervocational courses, they'll be ranked in terms of vocational education and training, VET. And similarly, they might be a privately owned entity which is operating on a university-based environment, and they would be then classed in for us as a university-based provider. So the university-based providers had the highest share of students in over this period at 38%, but that was then ranked, I guess, secondly by our VET providers at 31% overall. But what was really interesting was in fact, the university-based providers' share, whilst less in terms of, was more in terms of student numbers, was less in terms of student weeks. as opposed to our vocational education training providers, which made up more of a proportion in terms of the volume, so the length of student courses that they were teaching compared to their number of students over that period of 2021. And just lastly, again, it's sort of pretty simple to just sort of pull out the big insights here around Asia Pacific being the #1 source market for university-based Alicos providers, as it traditionally has been. The top source markets remain to be in that category: China at 55% of the total students. And in terms of the largest proportion of students with no other visa, I should say, there was a 23% share of that which went into those university-based providers, largely teaching students offshore throughout Asia, which was referenced with China and the large number of students that were still continuing to do pathway English courses whilst remaining offshore. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Svetlana to provide more in-depth analysis on a state overview.
Thank you, Brett, for providing us the national market overview of the sector. So what I will be presenting in the next slides are the state overview. First, just a general picture of the state's performances, and then I will be going into detail for each state, but I probably have to go quickly some of the slides. So to start with the general picture of each state's New South Wales continued to record the highest number of students and weeks of all Australian states in 2021. So this is despite a decrease of over 50%, both in student numbers and student weeks for New South Wales. And for moving into Queensland, Queensland actually faced the biggest drop in 2021. So this is due to the large cohort of student pipeline studying on visitor visas in 2019. So it was actually the worst impacted of all states by border closures. In terms of year-over-year decrease in student numbers in 2021. So this was actually seen in South Australia. It experienced a decrease of 35% in 2021 compared to 2020. In terms of Victoria, student numbers fell by 57% in 2021, and it also dropped a 64% for its student weeks. And lastly, for Western Australia, it faced a decline of 51%, so over 50% as well, in terms of its student numbers and student weeks in 2021. And here just a quick snapshot of what was the development in each state over the past 5 years. So as expected, all states had a declining performance, and here we can see that New South Wales, having the largest market share of student numbers in 2019, was also the most impacted with border closures in 2020. And here, just a quick look on source regions per state. So this actually shows that the market share of each source region is majorly from Asia Pacific. So this, of course, reflects from what Brett showed earlier at the national level. So Asia Pacific main source region for for all of the states. But looking at South Australia here, it actually recorded the highest share of students from the Asia Pacific region. And of course, this is thanks to its top source market, which is China. Now, I will be showing this later on in the next slides, but China here in South Australia provided 46% of its student population for South Australia. And for Western Australia here, we can see that the Americas performed best for this state, and we're in 40% of students from the Americas decrease in 2021 as a year-over-year comparison. So starting now with New South Wales, so despite further declines in 2021, New South Wales continued to record the highest number of students and weeks of all Australian states. Its student market share rose to 43% in 2021, from 39% in 2020. And of course, this trend is brought by the decline in student market shares by other states, such as Queensland. And here, just an overview of New South Wales performance over the past 10 years. We can see here the significant drop again in 2020, which of course continued in 2021. So again, in 2021, New South Wales faced a 52% decline compared to 2020. And if we compare the 2021 levels from 2019, the loss is bigger as expected, with a drop of 74%. So that's 2021 compared to 2019 in student numbers for New South Wales. And moving on to New South Wales, top 10 source countries. So here, the markets remain the same. However, Nepal replaced Colombia as the second largest country. So Nepal actually rose from 5th place in 2020. And this was actually partly because both Japan and Brazil faced more significant drops in 2021 than Nepal. Some of New South Wales source markets proved resilient. For example, Nepal decreased only by 33% in 2021. Although Colombia, one of the most resilient markets as well in 2020, both New South Wales at the national level as well, it actually experienced a steeper decline in 2021. So it actually dropped into 62% for Colombia in New South Wales. And here, just an overview of the top 5 source countries for New South Wales based on student numbers and student weeks. We can see here that the top 5 source markets for both metrics are actually not the same. So students from South Korea studied longer compared to students from Japan and Brazil. So we can see here from the list, Brazil not included as the top source markets in terms of student weeks. So majority of these students looking into South Korea studied actually in vet-based providers, followed by standalone Alicos colleges. So this is again for South Korea based in student weeks. And here, just an overall view of the top 10 source countries for the main provider types in the state. Here, Nepal is the top source market for standalone Alicos colleges in 2021. So we can see that trend from as a top 10 source market for the state. So it actually replaced Brazil as the top source market for standalone Alicos colleges in New South Wales. Looking at university-based colleges, so more than half of the students studying here were actually from China. So this trend is actually going to be seen. We're going to see this trend for the rest of the states, but here focusing on New South Wales, majority of the students university-based are from China. And from 5th position in 2020, Colombia is now the top source market for base providers in 2021. And here, student volume by provider type for New South Wales. So most students, which is 36% of the market share in New South Wales, continue to study in English with vet-based providers, both in terms of student numbers and student weeks. The market share of each provider type is actually tied to their top source countries. So if we look back, Colombia, as mentioned earlier, is one of the resilient source markets for Australia and New South Wales. So this is also seen in vet-based provider as its top source country in 2021. And here, university-based providers as well, so an increase in market share. So in 2020, it was actually 28% university-based providers for market share in New South Wales. And it actually increased in 2021 to 34% of the state's market share. So where we can actually associate as the share of its top source market, which is China, and wherein majority of these students are actually studying in university-based providers. And here, just a quick look of the economic impact of each regions in New South Wales. Asia Pacific, as expected, had the largest contribution for New South Wales, but it also had the largest decrease in absolute numbers. So it actually decreased $137 million for 2021 if we compare it to 2020. And as for the year-over-year performance, Americas faced the largest drop at 71% in 2021. For the top 10 source countries by economic contribution, so basically here, we can see almost the same in terms of the top source markets, but here, since South Korea was actually in the top 5 source markets for student weeks. So economic contribution is also tied with, of course, the student weeks, how long the students are actually studying. So here we can see that South Korea is 4th as a source market for economic contribution. So in this sense, we can actually see how important the metrics of student weeks when it comes to identifying like who are actually the biggest contributor, or what are the source markets that are important when it comes to by economic contribution for Australia. And moving on to Queensland now. As mentioned earlier, Queensland faced the biggest drop of all states in student numbers in 2021. As a large cohort of its student pipeline in previous years was on visitor visas. So when we look actually at the trend data from 2016 to 2019, so around 28 to 36% of the visitor visa share for Queensland is from this visa type. So it is expected that the most impacted by border closures is actually Queensland. And here, as mentioned earlier, 2021 versus 2020 performance of Queensland, it was around it's around 66%. In terms of student numbers. And if we compare 2021 levels with 2019, the drop was actually the highest among states, which is at 83% drop 2021 to 2019. And here quickly for the top source markets for Queensland, so it remained the same, with the exception of Spain and France. So 2 European countries, mostly under visitor visas or working holiday visas. As expected, it dropped significantly so Spain dropped 84% in 2021 compared to 2020, and then France at 78%. So these 2 countries were replaced by Vietnam and India. And as seen here, all top source markets, with the exception of Vietnam, all face significant drops, with the highest for Brazil, with a drop of 75% in 2021 compared to 2020. So as for Queensland's top 5 source countries for student numbers in weeks, the performance of all countries are the same for both metrics, student numbers, and student weeks. So we have China, Colombia, Japan, Brazil, and South Korea. And looking into detail for the top 10 source countries for main provider types, both Queensland's top 2 source countries had the largest market share by provider type. So Colombia here replaced Brazil as the top source market for standalone Alicos colleges. and China and Colombia remains to be the source market for university-based and vet-based colleges, respectively. So here we can see China with a 59% market share of university-based providers. In terms of student volume by provider types for Queensland, so here we can see that university-based hold the highest market share, followed by vet, as mentioned earlier. And if we look at back in 2019, as I mentioned, 74% of students were studying on visitor visas. And most of these are actually were attending standalone ELICOS colleges. So given that changes, given how the visitor visa declined over the past years, standalone ELICOS colleges now hold just 18% of the market share in Queensland in 2021. And for economic region, we can see here the largest drop in Americas, from the Americas region, and Europe as well, with both over 80% drop in terms of economic impact from these regions. For the top 10 source countries by economic contribution, so here it is reflected how these top 10 source countries from the Americas, such as Colombia and Brazil, having the largest drop in its economic contribution as well in the state, with over 80% drop by its economic impact. For South Australia, as mentioned earlier, saw the smallest year-over-year decrease over 2021. And in terms of visa type, South Australia actually enrolled the largest share of non-student visa holders, which is 43% of its student number market share. And of these non-student visa holders, the other and no visa type comprise actually 42% of the state's market share. So majority of the students in South Australia were studying offshore online with no visa. And looking again into detail in this cohort, 97% of these students were from China. And here, South Australia's performance over the years. So if we compare 2021 from 2019 levels, the drop was at 58%. And then 2021, of course, compared to 2020 was at 35%. So here immediately in this slide, we can see that China obviously holds the largest market share for South Australia. It experienced a slight decrease of 17% compared to other states. So sending 46% of South Australia's student population is actually from China. Colombia, on the other hand, replaced Japan as the second source market, as Japan continues to decline in 2021 for South Australia. But on a positive note, the state, despite a small increase, still saw an increase on its top 10 source markets, namely from Nepal, which experienced a 16% increase, and then Kenya with over 100% decrease. And for South Australia's trend of its top 5 source markets in terms of student numbers and student weeks, so we have China, Colombia, Japan, Vietnam, and South Korea in terms of student numbers, top 5 source markets. But in student weeks, we have China, Colombia, India, Vietnam, and Taiwan. So students from India and Taiwan were studying longer in South Australia in 2021 compared to students from Japan and South Korea. So most of the students from India and Taiwan, in terms of student weeks, were studying in vet and university-based providers. So here is the breakdown for the top 10 source countries for the main provider types. We were only able to provide for university and vet-based providers, as the multi-sector had a small market share in 2021 for us to showcase. But focusing here, 95% of Chinese students were studying at university-based providers in South Australia, wherein they make up 60% for the total student population in 2021. In terms of vet-based providers, Colombia from 4th position in 2020 replaced India as the top source market in 2021. So here, again, given that majority of Chinese students were studying at university-based providers in South Australia, we can see here that the highest market share is being held by university-based providers in 2021. And this is a big increase compared to university-based providers' market share in 2020, which is at 45%. Vet-based is at 21% in market share student numbers and 29% as well in student weeks. And if we look at multi-sector, so comparing it to these two provider types, it actually is small in terms of its share at 10% for student numbers. As for the economic impact of each regions in South Australia, Asia Pacific faced the smallest decline in 2021 compared to 2020. So of course, this is thanks to China, while Europe had the largest drop at 81% in 2021 with year-over-year comparison. For the top 10 source countries by economic contribution, so what is notable here is that Taiwan ranked 3rd as South Australia's top source market. So it actually increased by 21% in 2021 compared to 2020. So there's an increase in terms of economic contribution if we compare it from the previous year. And China, of course, still is, it's the largest economic contributor with a decrease of 17% with its economic impact in South Australia. As for Victoria, 25% of the student market share are from the state. So second from New South Wales, although it experienced a 57% decrease in student numbers and further drops in student weeks at 64%. And if we compare the 2021 data from the 2019 data, so it's expected that the decrease, the drop was actually higher at 77% with the 2021 levels from 2019 levels. As for Victoria's top 10 source countries, it remained the same, with the exception of Malaysia. It was replaced by Nepal, as Malaysia faced further drops with 75% decrease in 2021 compared to 2020. So yes, China is the top source market for Victoria, followed by Colombia, Japan, India, and Vietnam. Here, the top 5 source countries in terms of student numbers and student weeks for Victoria had a similar performance with its, both metrics had a similar performance. So China, Colombia, Japan, India, and Vietnam, again, for top 5 source markets in numbers and weeks. And for the top 10 source countries, in terms of provider types, Chinese students continue to be a top source market, both for standalone ELICOS colleges, which is 33% of all Chinese students, and university-based providers at 56% for Victoria. Colombia here also proved resilient in Victoria, continuing to be its top source market for vet-based providers, hosting 25% of all Colombian students in the state. On the other hand, 71% of all Japanese students. So if we look at Japan study and university-based providers, 54% of these students in Japan and university-based providers are studying offshore with no visa. And for India, unlike other source markets whose students are largely concentrated in one or two provider types, Indian students are actually distributed across the three provider types. So if you look at India here, with university-based providers, there's 6%, that base at 35%, and standalone ELICOS colleges 28% in terms of its contribution to the provider types. And here quickly, student volume by provider types for Victoria, university-based with holding the largest market share, followed by vet-based and standalone ELICOS colleges. Economic impact of each region in Victoria, as expected as well. Asia Pacific holds the highest share, and then followed by the Americas, Middle East, North and Sub-Saharan Africa, and then Europe. And lastly, for Victoria, top 10 source countries by economic impact. What is notable with Victoria actually is how the trend of its source markets, both in student numbers, weeks, aligned to the distribution of source markets on provider types, is actually tied to the economic contribution of the source markets as well for the state. And lastly, for Western Australia, the state faced a 51% decline in student numbers and a decline of 56% in student weeks in 2021. And if we compare the 2021 levels from 2019, it also experienced over 70% decline, so 73% decline in 2019 versus 2021. As for Western Australia's top 10 source countries, the source markets from 2019, France and Thailand were removed from the list in 2021. So as both countries face significant drops. And of course, in terms of Thailand, this is going to change with the latest data. But for 2021, it was replaced by Hong Kong and Vietnam. And for Colombia, it actually replaced China as the state's top source market. The Americas performed best in Western Australia with 40%, with only a 40% decrease in year-over-year comparison. Again, same performance with student numbers and student weeks, with a slight change with Taiwan and Japan's performance for student weeks in Western Australia. So students from Taiwan studied longer compared to Japan in 2021. In terms of provider types, top 10 source countries, so majority of the students in the state studied in standalone ELICOS colleges and university-based. So we only provided this slide just as a breakdown again. And standalone ELICOS colleges benefited mostly from its top source country, which is Colombia, wherein 27% of its market share is in this provider type. And as for university-based providers, it continued to rely on Asia-Pacific countries such as China, Japan, and Hong Kong, and with, of course, China holding the largest market share at 41%. So here, standalone ELICOS colleges, as mentioned, hold the highest share. It continued to have the top source, the top provider for the share in Western Australia, wherein the top source markets were from Colombia and Brazil. Economic regions in Western Australia, the Americas fared better here in terms of its contribution, of course, with its performance. And looking here, However, looking into detail with the top 10 source countries by economic contribution, despite Colombia being the top source market for Western Australia, the highest economic contributor is China, where a majority of the students are enrolled in university-based providers, with actually having the highest average tuition fee in Western Australia. So moving back to Brett, passing on to the next part of our
Thank you very much, Svetlana. You know, we're trying to cover as much data as we possibly can today in terms of the hour that we have to really give the insights on a whole year's worth of market performance indicators. Generally, that's the insights that we capture out of the annual market survey. But in this year's survey, we had some unique questions for providers. And I do want to preface and really give thanks to all of the participating colleges that did provide data into this section, as well as the whole survey, which I'll acknowledge in a moment. But what we did look at this year was of the total number of students, and you may recall we had some 39,000 total student numbers in that 2021 year. Of that, over 11,000 of them were recorded as being online students only. And in that proportion of online students, you can see here what we're representing is these have no face-to-face contact, but a large majority of them, some 88%, actually were offshore and studying their complete course online offshore during that year. So again, in this survey itself, of all of the respondents, we had 152 colleges actually provide their data back as part of this year's survey, which is a tremendous result, and particularly given all the challenges that colleges were facing. And of those, of the 152, 95% of them were operating in some form of online study and delivery as well. Now, as we break that down, what we can see next is that we asked providers, and hopefully that's coming through okay, but essentially whether they would continue to deliver online programs, noting that we're still operating in an area of regulatory flexibility and something that English Australia is continuing to look into and work with our regulatory bodies around. And we will soon be releasing a report which looks at some of the potential future opportunities or the way in which the future may look for Alicos providers. We asked questions around the appetite to continue operating in an online environment. And you can see that over 50% of the responding colleges noted that they had intention for some form of online delivery to be continuing, be that as a standalone program, a hybrid program, or a product in its own right in an online version, with only the smallest proportion undecided whether they would or wouldn't. Noting that this survey was conducted in March of this year, March 2020, so still relatively new in terms of its period. When we look at that in terms of where those students studied, the 11,000 students study, you can see the biggest proportion was in China. I think we've reported that throughout today's webinar, but also great to see particularly Japan, Vietnam, across the other areas of Asia Pacific were really sort of picking up and also having some form of online study. I mentioned at the start of the webinar, it hadn't really taken much market penetration through the European regions, and a smaller proportion of Latin Americans had initially taken the online study option, generally favouring the more travel-based in-country study. If I just move forward quickly, we looked at the impact that COVID had in terms of sort of financial operations and revenue. And I think it's pretty clear to see that a majority of colleges, some 43% of colleges, had estimated that this year or 2021 would have seen a decline in revenues of between 76% to 100%. When you add that together in terms of the two top categories, you're around 70% of providers had lost over 50% of their business. I think that's stands to really represent the resilience of the sector, given the small number of closures that we saw over this period. With the interest of time, I'm going to jump forward. We did ask a question around market projected trajectory of recovery. And in quickly looking at this, the expectation was sort of to get back to those levels of 2019. 80% of the colleges thought that they would be almost there, the responding providers, by about 2024. We're seeing a bit of a mixed recovery, and certainly at the moment, higher growth in private ELICOS providers. Whereas you look at the total market, then obviously when we're looking at this data, some providers will be saying, well, it might be a bit slower, and others are seeing the market recovery coming through much quicker. I'm just going to jump forward into the year-to-date data and try and do a last-minute overview of where the position is at now year-to-date. So that concludes all of the survey results for the 2021 Market ELICOS report. We will be distributing that report after today's webinar. So all of the 152 participating institutions will have the report sent directly to them. And there will be an executive summary which we'll have available for any other stakeholder that would like to be able to see those headline results. And hopefully we can share and disseminate the information as quickly as possible. English Australia produces a monthly market report, and each month we look at the student visa commencements alone, as well as what's happening in the student visa data. We have released this April report already, and just today, ahead of today's session, the Department of Education shared a few insights into the actual May year-to-date figure. So looking at the slide on the screen now, this represented the first increase that we'd seen in 2 years for the English language sector, with an overall growth in commencements for ELICOS up 4.4%. The good news is when you look at this now, and what we will produce shortly will be the May data. May is actually showing an increase of 19.6% for the market. So hot off the press, and before we've been able to do the full market report aggregation to disseminate, just letting you know that we're actually seeing some better signs coming through in terms of the recovery. And again, probably more in that independent ELICOS sector at the moment. Enrollments overall remain down, and down just over 14% for the market. In this April data set, you'll see, as I mentioned, we're up about 4%, and that was largely on quite a big increase that came through in terms of student commencements in April. My anticipation is what we'll have now coming through in the May period, we'll see that what was a really low month last year in terms of May, as the market continued to decline, the overall student body will go from total commencements year to date of around 13,000 to total commencements year to date of just over 18,000 with the May data. So an additional 5,000 student commencements in this last month of May. Where has this growth come from? Well, largely it's been generated from the really strong performance out of Thailand. As you can see here, Thailand year to date was showing a market increase of over 300%. Now, it's interesting when you look at that 374% increase year to date, and I know in some of you have seen a recent seminar that I was presenting around the state where I looked back at research that had happened back in 2016, and that growth and opportunities research actually pegged Thailand by 2025 to be the number 2 source destination in Australia after China. So interestingly enough, at the moment, with the visa numbers not representing the total market out of China, obviously, particularly as we've just pointed out, those that are studying online offshore, China is still down. And as we go into May, China remains down at around 34% below market. whereas Thailand actually increases again. And the market growth out of Thailand goes up to 500% year on year. So 500% from 2021 to 2022. But in actual numbers, the raw numbers are around 3,200. And that surpasses where the market was back at even in 2018, which was around 2,700 for Thailand. But good signs equally out of Brazil. Brazil up 100%. Colombia still slightly down, but improving, down 16%. Japan also up, and lovely to see Japan up year on year, 60%, with growth also out of Vietnam and Chile. Now, that data that I'm speaking to you about will be in our next monthly report representing the May data. So that just is an overlay to what you're seeing. On a state perspective, Queensland was the biggest market to decline in the data that Svetlana just presented. At the moment, it's got the greatest growth happening as well, and largely in that student visa cohort. Year to date, you can see it was tracking at 11% in April. That's actually jumped to a 37% growth in May. So some big student enrollment growth happening up in Queensland. Victoria was up 8%. It's actually up 27%. New South Wales has the largest market share, still retaining the total number of students share, slightly lower, but growth of 16%. SA up 22%. We're still seeing a little bit of a decline in WA, but an improvement. It's down 17%. And NT, TAS, and ACT are down 54%, 11%, and 3% respectively. I know we're on time, everyone, and my apologies, we haven't been able to conclude within the hour. I'm going to just give a very quick sort of 2-minute overview, if not less, on the current visa performance, noting that this is the April visa data, and in our monthly report, we will give you some more insights into the May perspective. But essentially, it's a positive picture in terms of the pipeline. Overall visas in April were, total visa grants were up almost or just under 20% across the sector. And we've seen visa lodgements across all sectors up over 111%. If I look at that next in terms of independent ELICOS, the independent ELICOS, and this is where I was sort of being able to break it down for those providers outside of pathways and packages. Independent ELICOS visa offshore grants was something that we're really happy to see up. And that was some 47% higher than what it was, 47 times higher than what it was this time last year, which obviously was an all-time low. But you can see in terms of real terms, we're actually starting to head back up to quite good volumes. I'm going to just quickly look at the lodgement pipeline, and on the lodgement pipeline, again, some really strong numbers. We are working closely with the Department of Home Affairs to ensure that this volume is getting processed. We're aware of some of the backlogs in processing and the processing times. But that volume increase was a 14 times increase on prior year, and you can see how it's overshadowing in many of the past periods for a year-to-date perspective as well. I'll quickly look next on the monthly track. A slight little dip came through in April, but after a really big surge year-to-date up to March. And I'm going to just close it out by looking at it on a state perspective. And I've just mentioned what we saw coming through in terms of commencements. Well, again, Queensland really doing, I guess, healthy in terms of bounce back year-to-date commencements. But the pipeline for visa lodged for particularly Queensland, New South Wales, and after that Victoria is showing some really strong flows coming through. We'd love to see some more student volume coming through into the other states, WA, South Australia, ACT, NT, TAS. I know that there's a lot of commitment from those providers too, and we want to be able to see the market grow for all colleges across Australia. Colleagues, that's the end of today's presentation. Do apologise, we're 5 minutes over time, but we've tried to present as comprehensive analysis and update on the 2021 market survey, as well as a quick snapshot of year to date. As mentioned, big thanks to all of the 152 colleges that provided their input into the survey. Special thanks to the Department of Education for their ongoing support and commitment to this research. Acknowledgement and thanks to my colleague Svetlana and the team from Bonard. And if there's any questions, queries, or things you would like to follow up on, please don't hesitate to contact English Australia and we'll happily follow up with you on that as well. Thanks everyone for your time and all the best. Bye for now.